Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. A couple of kind of quick housekeeping points. I hope that you joined us last week when we had our town hall discussion about back to the workplace with Secretary Walsh from Labor and Owen Thomas, Fred Siegel, and John Fish. It was, I thought, a great discussion. If you didn't see it and would like to, you can view the replay on our website or YouTube channel or whatever. Just email me and I'll send you the link. It was very, very good. A couple of other things, just, we do have our roundtable session coming up in late April in person. It's going to be our first meeting since the pandemic started. We're excited about that. And then we have our annual meeting in June, and I hope you'll attend the annual meeting. It should be good. We've got our policy agenda out. I noted last week that we did successfully get the EB5 program not only cleaned up, but reauthorized, cleaned up, and extended for 5 years. And we're proud of that accomplishment there. We're busy analyzing the new ESG regulations that are proposed rules that came out from the SEC earlier this week regarding measuring your greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. We continue to look at the pandemic risk insurance area. We've got our diversity program and project that I think we're about ready to make a very interesting, exciting announcement on, and a lot of other things. The tax world, we're focused. I see Frank Kramer is on the call here. We're focused on issues relating to how we can help convert office buildings and other assets that aren't being used into housing. And so we're pretty busy. Thank you for your support on everything. Before we're a real estate group, we're human beings and we're citizens, and the tragedy and the ongoing debacle over there, whatever word you want to use, I think all of us are disgusted by, and we want to talk and find out a little bit more insider how we got there and maybe where we're going. Then more broadly speaking, I suppose, is just the impact that the war is having on the economy and might have on the economy. Goldman Sachs has reduced their GDP outlook for the year since the war started. Obviously, oil has shot up, gas prices are increasing. All of this is adding to the what I guess we would call the supply chain shock from the pandemic, and it's not good. And we'll have to see that. And then as we go forward, how our industry might be involved in rebuilding some of the devastated areas once this crisis is over, and hopefully it will end soon. But so that's why we're talking about it today, and we are thrilled and honored to have as our guest Alexander Vinman. And I'm going to read, because I don't want to get any of it wrong. It's spectacular. Retired U.S. Army Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vinman. Okay. He was born in Soviet Ukraine, emigrated to the U.S. as a child, and was first commissioned in the Army in 1999 as an infantry officer. He's a combat veteran of the Iraq War. He received a Purple Heart for injuries sustained from a roadside bomb in 2004. In 2008, he became the Foreign Area Officer specializing in Eurasia and served in the embassies in Ukraine and Moscow. He reached the rank of, some gnat or something got in my mouth. He reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in 2015, advised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on matters involving Russia, and accepted an assignment as Director of European Affairs with the National Security Council in 2018. Of course, he found himself at the center of the firestorm regarding his decision, and I think we all applaud his decision to disclose the phone call between then President Trump and the newly elected Ukrainian President Zelensky regarding withholding aid. And obviously this was a central part to the first impeachment of the president. 21 years in the military. He's now retired, 2020. He's got a book out, by the way, I'd recommend it, called Here, Right Matters, An American Story. It's a great read about his career and work in the Ukraine and so forth. He's now a senior advisor, and this is very important. I hope people will focus on this. He's a senior advisor at Vote Vets, and that's an organization that provides assistance and so forth, matters regarding Ukraine and other efforts. And if you'd like to support his efforts or learn more about it, we're going to have a link in our chat room. Please take a look at it. If you do make a contribution to it, they're tax deductible. And with that, I will stop. But just thank you all for your support of the roundtable and for your interest in today's session. Again, we're very, very honored to have Alexander Vindman. He told me to call him Alex, which I'm uncomfortable doing, but I am going to call him Alex. So Alex, the floor is yours, sir. How did we get here? Where are we going? What's happened? Everything's changing day to day, it seems like. And if you can bring us up to speed, we'd benefit from that. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks to the Real Estate Roundtable for inviting me to speak about this critically important topic. It's what's consuming the news cycle for the past 5 weeks. It's something that's going to continue to consume the news cycle for the foreseeable future. It's a geopolitical earthquake that's unfolded over the course of the past year or so, culminating in a war between the largest country in the world and the largest country in Europe. Just think of that. You're as real estate leaders, that's a lot of real estate right there. And the possibility of a limited war is a little bit of wishful thinking. It's already spilled over into economic effects. Refugee flows have been enormous. Some 3.5 million people flooding into Eastern Europe. A lot of devastated territories in Ukraine. Environmental disasters unfolding. And the very real possibility of a spillover into a hot war, which is frankly why this situation needs to be managed, a hot war, a broader hot war between NATO and Russia. That's why the situation needs to be managed so carefully and managed in a way that doesn't escalate to a bilateral confrontation, but also managed in a way that ends this war quickly, because the longer this war continues, the greater the chance of spillover, the greater chance that Vladimir Putin, who is comfortable ratcheting up pressure, his historical pattern is to increase pressure to achieve his outcomes, is likely to probe and prod and cross some red line thresholds. We see some of those. We see ourselves kind of approaching some of those relatively within the first days of the war. An attack on the nuclear power plant. We could see if there was a nuclear disaster, how that could have easily unfolded in NATO having to take a position where they had to secure more nuclear power plants, based on the fact that that has a direct impact on NATO. Cyber warfare spilling over as Russia feels the pain of economic sanctions. Russia employing chemical agents to achieve its battlefield effects because its military is having such a terribly hard time achieving their military objectives. So there's a bunch of different ways that this spills over. And it's not simply just of managing the risks and avoiding or sitting out on the sidelines and avoiding U.S. involvement. That's part of the formula of how we got to this confrontation in the first place. It's 22 years of Putin's rule and not being held accountable for increasingly provocative behavior, whether that's domestically and attacking private property rights as he expropriated assets from oligarchs and consolidated them under a law, the law enforcement and security services, or waging war on his own population in Chechnya, destroying large swaths of that autonomous region, interfering in Ukraine's elections in 2004, resulting in the Orange Revolution, waging war in Georgia as punishment for a potential roadmap to joining NATO, war in 2014 against Ukraine. So that started an 8-year war in Syria. He's very comfortable in war, and because he believes he's won all the previous wars. And then interference in our elections, assassination plots, successful assassinations through chemical agents and nuclear agents and so forth. He believes that he's a rational actor that believes that he could get away with it because there's a lack of reaction from the West. So that in no way is a prescription for us to sit out on the sidelines here, because Russian success in Ukraine breeds Russian aspirations for Moldova, Georgia, and potentially even NATO territory. That's a high bar, but that's not unrealistic. That's the almost incontrovertible roadmap to how we got here, accelerated by 4 years of Donald Trump. And this is not political. It's just simply that Donald Trump, in a lot of ways, helped Vladimir Putin with his aspirations of driving a wedge between the U.S. and NATO. There was an amount of controversy about the viability of NATO during his tenure, and you have guys like John Bolton, the former national security advisor, that has been on the record saying that Trump was keen to withdraw from NATO and from those obligations. And then the discord within the United States, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, perceived as a vulnerability, as a weakness, something that distracted us. So that's just the kind of the quick history of how we got to this. Now, we're in the midst of a geopolitical earthquake. It's limited. The warfare itself is so far limited to Russia and Ukraine, but the effects, as you can tell, are much broader than that. Instability in Europe, our most important alliance. Economic shocks, whether that's U.S. GDP output, inflation. Those are going to be that'll be the legacy for easily through the rest of this year and beyond. And then the very important, because of Ukraine's success, we could now see Ukraine exiting this war as a sovereign, independent state. The question would be, after what kind of losses, how much damage? Russia doesn't have the combat power to achieve its military objectives. It doesn't have the combat power to occupy Ukraine. It does have the resources and means to destroy Ukrainian cities and inflict massive Ukrainian casualties. And as you could imagine, the U.S. population and the democratic world doesn't have a huge appetite for that. So that's another recipe for broader involvement. But it should be recognized as Ukraine really changing the trajectory of geopolitics for the foreseeable future. At one point, it looked like you had a very powerful country, the second most powerful military in the world, seizing a very large amount of territory and a population of 40 million. We were set up for a world in which China might have similar aspirations. Iran might have similar aspirations of nuclearizing and targeting smaller countries. Ukraine has shifted all that. Ukraine's shifted that because it stymied Russia's aspirations, and it's compelled the authoritarian world to be a little bit introspective, not a hallmark of authoritarianism, about their false assumptions about military power, about the vulnerabilities of the democratic world, the incohesion of the democratic world. Clearly, the democratic world has consolidated in support of democracy with these unprecedented sanctioning Russia's central bank, sanctioning large swaths of the economy, cutting many of Russia's financial institutions out of financial transactions through SWIFT sanctions. And this is the future of the competition between democracy and authoritarianism. So the Ukrainians have been very successful in preserving the world order for us in a way that's going to help advance U.S. interests in the long term. So and then they're probably going to, somewhere on the back end of this, my expectation is they've captured the imagination of the world. They're going to have a very large reconstruction effort. The Europeans, various European states, have already talked about $100 billion euro reconstruction fund that doesn't include U.S. contributions or commercial sector contributions. This is likely to be hundreds of billions of dollars of reconstruction funds coming in to clear out unexploded ordnance, to dispose of Russian military material, to rebuild roads, bridges, and invest in Ukraine's economy into those critically important sectors. It has a plethora of commodities. For those of you that are maybe invested in the tech sector, neon, it's a leading provider in neon, titanium, several other resources. Agricultural sector, it's going to have shocks around the world, mainly because the Middle East and Africa buy a enormous amount of grain from Ukraine. It's the breadbasket, not just of Europe, it's the breadbasket of the world. And that's going to be another kind of shock. And then the tech sector is quite potent, transportation hubs and so forth. So that's the future, over the subsequent months and years. This war is likely to play out relatively slowly. U.S. is providing, and the NATO are providing relatively modest amounts of aid that are not going to allow Ukraine to decisively defeat Russia, because the critical advantages that Russia has that Ukraine can't contend with are planes, helicopters, and ballistic missiles that could be launched from hundreds of miles away. So unless the U.S. and NATO are able to supply Ukraine, meet Ukraine's requests for these types of systems, it's likely to play out over the course of months. So that's the rundown of how we got here, what's going on, and where we're going in 15 minutes.
Yeah, Alex, thank you for that. Were you surprised? It seems like, were you surprised about the inefficiencies or the lack of strength of the Russian military in terms of it seems like they're not as good as people thought they were, and were you? I'm just wondering if you, in your work, had intelligence that showed that they were as dysfunctional as they seem to be, but also about the strength of NATO and the ability of President Biden to bring NATO together and rally. Were you surprised about those two things, or could you see those coming?
Yeah, so I saw this war coming for many months. Not everybody agreed with me. I seemed to be out on a limb back in the November timeframe, and in the December timeframe, I wrote a piece in the New York Times saying that this war was all but certain to happen, and we must do more to avert it. Sanctions, forced posture changes, arming the Ukrainians, and even if we did that, that might not be enough. We didn't do any of those things. And then by the time we got into January, I just kind of laid out the case of exactly what we see unfolding, and what we needed to do in order to help Ukraine win this war or survive this war. And so far, those things are, I'm frankly tired of being right and not being able to do anything to kind of influence the situation in a sufficient enough manner. With regards to Russian weakness, I spent 3 years in Moscow watching the Russian army rearm, spend billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars on rearmament programs. And on paper, their capabilities looked really quite powerful. Advanced aircraft, advanced armor, electronic warfare capabilities, all sorts of different stuff. And they were able to piece those those capabilities together effectively for small scale contingencies. Ukraine in 2014 for a sliver of Ukraine's territory, in Syria, but they were not able to effectively employ them in what we call combined arms, like using air power, ground forces, electronic warfare. They were not able to do that. I am surprised because I didn't go so far as to as many of my colleagues that thought Russia was going to roll over Ukraine. I sensed something about this key component of morale and fighting spirit, which has been a decisive factor here. Ukrainians are defending high-minded notions like freedom and democracy, but they're also defending their homes, and the Russians are reluctant. And that has been absolutely critical. So, but the degree to which the Ukrainians have been successful and the Russians have failed has been shocking to anybody that monitors this. And Ukraine does have the manpower, the kind of really innovative military concepts to continue to do damage, but they can't take out planes that are flying at 70,000 feet. That's just not something they could contend with. They can't deal with ships that are firing cruise missiles from over the horizon, or ballistic missiles that are cruising in from hundreds of kilometers away. They're fighting and dying for the kind of the defense of the democratic institutions in the free world, but they're not being armed to fight effectively, which is frankly a shame. That kind of goes to the question of the strength of NATO. I think this administration gets an enormous amount of credit about building the very foundation for the response. So that was all the legwork in the preceding months to get the world together about a response to Russian provocation. I completely disagree with them on the basis of the fact that everything was reactive. I understand why. They waited until the blows started to land before they took action, because they needed to a certain extent, they needed cohesion amongst NATO and amongst the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. But I think we could have done more to potentially avert it. But they get all the credit for everything that's unfolded since, because they laid the groundwork. They did the spade work with the democratic world to make some of these things happen. And I would say we've always wanted the Europeans to do more about Ukraine security, about their own security. The Europeans are actually leading the charge. I think leading the European charge is Zelensky, that has become a leader of not just Ukraine, but of the free world, rallying the European Union to make some courageous decisions about central bank sanctions, about SWIFT sanctions, about sanctioning oligarchs. But the Europeans are actually leading, and we're following, which I'd hope to see the U.S. kind of in a more aggressive leadership role, but that's okay as long as we're close behind following. I think that's not a bad place to be. But there are certain things that we probably just need to be more thoughtful and courageous about, and those are kind of the risks of a protracted war, what those mean for U.S. national security, because they're enormous, and how we get into a protracted war scenario that's more risky, and a lot of it is through inaction. Not action, but inaction.
At your work at the National Security Council previously, would you ever get involved in the psychology of analyzing what the reaction might be? Because a lot of speculation out there about Putin being pushed into the corner, and he might react with chemical or nuclear or whatever, and just any thoughts that you have on the psychology of the situation right now. And then also, cyber you mentioned cyber, and there again, a lot of commentators would have said that he would have unleashed some cyber warfare earlier, and that really hasn't occurred. By the way, behind me is the ribbon. I'm sure you have the real thing. I have a fake of the ribbon given to forces in 2006 terrorism, the war on terrorism. And we at the Roundtable formed after 9/11 a very concerned, obviously, about physical security, but also cyber security of our buildings and our tenants and keeping people safe and so forth. And we formed a information sharing analysis center. Chip Rogers is on the call here. He does it with our staff. And so we're constantly exchanging information about physical and cyber threats. But where do you see all of this? The psychology and the cyber and and so forth.
So, I guess one of my biggest supporters has been both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, in terms of giving me kind of a voice to be able to talk about these issues, not just kind of in classified environments, but being pushed out of the military, being able to work on these things and focus my efforts on Russian aggression, great power competition between the U.S., Russia, and China. So I'm in your bio, you mentioned I served in Ukraine. I served in Russia for 3 years. Part of that, half of that tenure was when the war started, and observing and reporting. That's the term of art for the Defense Intelligence Agency. on Russian activities. From there, I went to the Pentagon and I authored the National Military Strategy for Russia. So it's the governing document on how we face the challenge of a belligerent, increasingly belligerent Russia. And we started putting the pieces together, in 2016 and 17. But that was well within Putin's trajectory, and we just didn't get to the point of deterrence quickly enough. In addition to that, I managed the affairs with between our military and the Russian military at the highest echelon. So translating for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs when cruise missiles were flying into Syria, striking Russian bases. I learned from that the Russians have no interest in tangling with the U.S. They were extremely anxious about being forced into a position of responding to U.S. Strikes that injured Russian soldiers, basically pleading to avoid that kind of scenario. They were extremely reluctant. They weren't just reluctant. They denied Russian forces attacking U.S. Special Operations Command in Syria that resulted in 300 dead. So I, again, witnessed firsthand their reluctance to tangle with NATO, U.S. and NATO. That's just in the conventional sense. The bar for nuclear sense is higher because it's mutually assured destruction. So, and then I went to the White House and worked on the same issues. You're right. Part of my background includes understanding Putin's mindset. It's driven by false assumptions. Many, at this point, many deeply flawed assumptions about the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people, their will to resist, the weakness of the U.S., which is proven false because we've rallied around Ukraine. It's brought us together, even if we, whether it's the far right or except for the far right and the far left, frankly. The far right and the far left think that we should retrench back to the U.S. But the 80% in the middle have all consolidated their views around support to Ukraine because it's no longer conceptual that there's a struggle for democracy, what that means. They could see it firsthand in the most televised war in the world. And, the psychology for Putin is pretty clear. It's just driven by these false assumptions. He was a rational actor. He got away with a lot of what he wanted for a very, very long time. That bred a kind of a sense of impunity. Now he's being recalibrated. There was always going to be a recalibration. I had hoped to see a kind of a more metered recalibration where President Biden defending U.S. national security interests would indicate that provocative behavior from Russia would be dealt with swiftly and harshly. That could have been in the form of sanctions along the way. That's not the case. Now it's playing out in the war. And he is being recalibrated. He's being recalibrated by frankly, tragic losses. I mean, we're talking about at minimum 15,000 Russian soldiers and 3 times as many casualties. So that's killed. The ratio killed to injured is usually 3 to 1. So it's 50,000 between killed and injured. That is tragic, frankly, even though they're their aggressors, because these are a lot of young kids that just didn't know that what they were stumbling into. They were convinced that this was a righteous war and stuff like that. It's one of the tragedies of war, and countless losses on the Ukrainian side. But the psychology, none of this suggests that Putin is an irrational actor. As a matter of fact, there's been plenty of the signaling and the saber rattling that Russia and the Soviet Union before it has used to warn off U.S. and Western aggression. They know what they're doing. They think they war game this out. They've seen this proven that if they signal nuclear deployment, we automatically go to our kind of primal fears of nuclear escalation. That's meant to deter us. That works effectively. But at the same time, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction is ironclad. The Russians feel this even more acutely. Their senior military is actually in the nuclear employment chain, unlike our chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not. It's the president is the authority, but for them it's Putin, it's the Ministry of Defense, it's the Chief of the General Staff. All have 2 out of 3 have to concur. So that doctrine is ironclad. There has not been an erosion of that doctrine. As a matter of fact, there have been some helpful kind of remarks. The former prime minister and at one point president Dmitry Medvedev said, nuclear employment is in case of a threat, existential threat to the regime. We're nowhere near that. So to me, that was helpful. That wasn't saber rattling. That was actually, kind of articulating Russian doctrine or reinforcing Russian doctrine. With regards to cyber, I see cyber as an interesting indicator of the same kind of reluctance to tangle directly with the US and NATO. We did expect to see it. We expected to see it in a big way in Ukraine. They didn't do that because it's not a surgical instrument. It had every possibility of spilling over. So they decided to hold back that tool. It might be something that as the war progresses, they actually employ heavy cyber warfare against the US in response to, and NATO in response to economic warfare, our economic warfare, as they call it. But that's not happened yet. And I think it just continues to indicate the reluctance to have this expand beyond the borders of Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. We've got a few questions that have come from listeners and so forth. Thank you, Alex, for all of that. And they're kind of, in my mind anyway, connected, a couple of the questions. One is kind of how do you see Putin exiting? What's his exit? What's the off ramp? How does he get out of this situation if he wants to get out of this situation? And then also kind of connected is, how do you think the Russian people are, obviously the news is shut off a bit, but there must be some getting through. And how is that playing into everything, and where do you see it going?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I've been studying this for a long time as a practitioner, but I'm actually at the Johns Hopkins right now, working on my doctorate. I'm supposed to defend in May. The topic is U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine since 1991. So it's a story, the background of how we got here. I understand the kind of the nuances of this a long road to war. With regards to Vladimir Putin's solution, it is more than likely going to be some combination of diplomatic effort in earnest. Right now, it's not in earnest. When larger portions of his military are destroyed, when he's in fact to a certain extent demilitarized his own military because of the catastrophic consequences of this war. An effort and that's probably still weeks away or months away, because the Russians, it's a country of 140 million. They have massive depots of like older antiquated equipment. All their new stuff is getting destroyed right now. But somewhere at the end of this, there's going to be a more earnest effort to negotiate. That earnest effort is going to still try to force the Ukrainians to comply with some of the demands. There might be a compromise. That compromise might mean a recognition of this annexed portion of Crimea that was annexed in 2014. But frankly, for Vladimir Putin, this ultimately ends with him saying, congratulations, Russian army, we won. We've demilitarized, denazified Ukraine. The cities are ruined. The military industrial complex is ruined. Time to go home. He could do that. He controls the information environment. He's a dictator, so he could actually turn on a dime. What I don't think it is the U.S. playing anything but a marginal role in some of these negotiations, because it's the Ukrainians that are going to kind of settle this on the ground, and it's the Ukrainians that are going to settle this directly with the Russians. In the past, when the mismatch between Ukraine and Russia looked much bigger, there were other kind of Normandy formats. The Germans and the French were involved to help kind of balance out and arbitrate. But this is going to be settled between Russia and Ukraine directly, with maybe some of the rest of the world playing a shaping role at best. With regards to the Russian people, there is a very, very tight control over the information environment, and there's a significant amount of support even now for Putin's war. But the population hasn't started feeling the economic effects yet. There have been relatively modest, on the scale of tens of thousands of protesters for political protests, anti-war protests, but those haven't turned socioeconomic yet. Those are going to turn socioeconomic over the course of weeks and months. And that's going to be the same time that the budget's going to be strained to pay the security services, pay law enforcement. So that's going to put pressure. And the body bags coming back or not coming back. Frankly, the Russians don't want the bodies of their soldiers coming back. The missing in action or the killed in action, they've already acknowledged somewhere on the order of 10,000. That is going to have a major destabilizing effect. There are kind of, the Russians have crushed civil society, but there's a history of mothers groups. They emerged in soldiers, mothers groups that emerged in Afghanistan that nurtured civil society, forced the Soviet Union to contend with these issues. Soviet Union had 15,000 casualties over the course of 10 years of war, and the Soviet Union was twice as large as Russia. They've had that many casualties in a month. More than that, actually, more than Afghanistan, and for a country half the size. So it's going to create major problems, as well as the military defeats that are occurring quickly, but not quickly enough. So it's going to be have to be all these issues, and I would like to see the U.S. Provide weapons. If you agree with me, I would encourage you to contact your you have powerful voices, to contact your congressmen and senators and the executive branch that they need to do more, because that's not just in our interest. That's also the humane thing to do, to stop the bloodshed. But it is clearly in our interest to help Ukraine. The problem is that there is just a misconception from this administration that this
source that we use is deeply affected by the ecosystems within which we all live.
We need to mute somebody there. Yeah.
And then just one last thing. Sorry. The last thing I'd mention on this is there are ways to penetrate the information environment. One of the things I've done, through my efforts and with the support of Vote Vets, you guys may have seen and ladies, if they're on here, you may have seen the Arnold Schwarzenegger video. That was my idea, based on a relationship I had with him. That was intended to penetrate the information environment.
Targeted. Very powerful. It was a very powerful video. If people haven't seen it, you should dial that up. It's quite
I don't advertise it because it could taint it, at least not publicly, but in small groups, it's not that big a deal. The whole idea was really to have a voice that resonates with the Russian population. So he has a relationship with the Russian people going back, 40 years almost. Speaking to them about their misconceptions about this war. And then, of course, the soldiers. One of the things that I was able to, after it was done, I was able to coordinate it with U.S. government, my contacts, my cabinet level officials in the Ukrainian government, to make sure it went to the handsets, the smartphones of Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine or fighting in Ukraine, so like this they could see it. And it's had a big effect in the Russian-speaking world, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in the Slavic world with regards to the Balkans. And those are the kinds of projects that I've been undertaking. I've done an enormous amount of fundraising, raised millions of dollars for charity groups. Again, I hang my hat through Vote Vets to be able to do my work, and then use my my long-standing network to raise capital for human rights. One of the things I'm working on is actually military material, because that's where, again, this is going to get settled on the battlefield. I'm working on getting Ukraine unmanned combat aerial vehicles, arms. I was successful in generating the idea and the efforts to transfer sophisticated Soviet era air defense missiles. So these S-300s, that was in part my doing, getting those transferred over. And that's the kind of work I do for Vote Vets. The other thing that I'm working on, low turn, this is all related, is the reconstruction effort. I'm building out an organization, frankly, modeled on some other public-private partnerships. You may be aware of some of those, where the U.S. seeds with some $100 million, and then the private sector comes in, to do manyfold more, to engage in these kinds of projects for reconstruction. So those are some other things I'm working on the kind of reconstruction side of this effort.
Alex, it sounds obviously you believe that we should be doing, and by we, I guess I mean the West should be doing more in terms of either supplying military equipment or so forth. How do you feel? Well, prior to World War II, obviously our country engaged in the Lend-Lease program. Should we be doing something more aggressive there? How do you feel about a no-fly zone? What about more active weapon supplies from the West into Ukraine to help them defend things? How do you feel about those activities?
That's a terrific question, Jeff. That's exactly what I wrote about in Foreign Affairs was it? No, I'm trying to, maybe it was Foreign Affairs. Yeah, I think it was Foreign Affairs, but that was after the war started. So that would have been in the past month. Everything's kind of a bit of a blur, but it's this notion that we need to establish a Lend-Lease program to stockpile, depot, warehouse humanitarian assistance. So that's food, water, fuel, medical supplies for a country of 40 million people, but also military material. You're right. We did this program actually years before we were involved in the war. We started a program in World War II to supply the Soviet Union to fend off the Nazis. It was instrumental in helping the Soviet Union withstand the Nazi aggression before they built the capacity to resist and win. This is what we should be doing. We should be providing the humanitarian stuff is absolutely apparent. It needs to be well coordinated. Right now, there are thousands and thousands of groups coming in, lots of international governmental organizations. I think the U.S. could play a leadership role there, or the EU, and do kind of an aid czar to orchestrate that. But the military material needs to be there also. It can't be something that we choose to send in on demand from Ukraine because transit's still an issue. It's not going to arrive on time. It's going to arrive late. And warehousing these capabilities on the border, on a very permeable border where the Russians can't strike into Western Ukraine, where there's really unfettered access and flow of support from Europe into Western Ukraine, is a no-brainer. And it should be the Javelin missiles, the Stingers. The Ukrainians want them in the quantities of 500 a day, but it should be unmanned combat aerial vehicles. The Turks have already been providing these vehicles. They've already kind of opened up that aperture. This is not new ground. There's a precedent. We should be doing something similar. We're deeply reluctant to do that. We think that's provocative. These MiG-29s, that is not a high bar. These are Soviet era systems that are being requested by a sovereign independent state at war, although Russia calls it a special military operation, that has the right to defend itself. And there is no basis, there's really no basis on which to believe that this is the trigger for World War III. That is not the same thing as US attacking Russia. This is the provision of material. There is a well-established precedent of proxy warfare. The Russians or the Soviet Union flew planes operated by Soviet pilots against US forces in North Korea. They armed, they operated the air defense systems in Vietnam that shot down our planes. We armed the Mujahideen. There's a well-established precedent of this kind of behavior. And we should have the faucet on wide open, not a trickle right now, without any real risk. And we should also recognize that the things that we thought were beyond the pale, like unbelievable, that 4 weeks ago we would be sanctioning Russia's central bank, or that SWIFT sanctions would be unfolding, or that we would be providing these Switchblade suicide drones. Those are the easy decisions. Those are going to be, it's only going to get harder from here. And we need to realize that there's a risk horizon, that, our hyper focus on short-term risk only increases risks over the long term. And that we probably need to be a little bit mindful of the risk horizon, that decisions are going to be harder in the future, and make some thoughtful decisions now. With regards to the no-fly zone, my simple answer to this is we might end up getting there based on Russian atrocities and Russian barbarism. Let's avoid that. because that would be a direct confrontation between U.S. and Russian forces. And the way we avoid that is by equipping Ukraine to establish its own no-fly zone.
I assume you've met Zelensky in the past or
Yes.
been around him.
Mhm.
He certainly seems pretty impressive out there. How do you score his speech to Congress, for example, and his other outreach to other world leaders? Was that a surprise to you, or did you know that he would step up the way he has?
My research to meeting him was watching his comedy shows, his comedy series on in Russian language. So I think the guy's hilarious. He's very charismatic, very charming, and he's emerged as a world leader. I sensed some of those traits when I met him. Even before I met him, I kind of started generating a concept, an action plan to more closely collaborate with the Ukrainian government that he was going to lead in the months preceding the war, just because I expected that he was going to win. And he did, and he established a new party that had landslide wins also. So I sensed that kind of some very important character traits for conflict: earnestness, bravery, and fortitude to kind of hold his ground. He's been bogged down for several years as a peacetime president, in part because Ukraine became radioactive after the Ukraine scandal, not just for the remainder of the Trump presidency, but also into the Biden presidency, because there was baggage there. So he did not get kind of the rhetoric of ironclad support didn't really materialize. So he was kind of out there on his own without the political wherewithal to achieve a lot of what he wanted to. That's all by the wayside now. He's a wartime leader. He's energized his country, his people to defend themselves. He's energized democracies around the world, the European Union, with very capable engagements. I think the only place that he kind of fell a little short was maybe with regards to Israel, and unfortunately, Israel is going to end up being on the wrong side of history. Not taking a particularly courageous position, bending to Russia's will here, not sanctioning Russian oligarchs, not stopping the flow of military sales to Ukraine to Russia, while at the same time not doing anything to help Ukraine. But I hope they come around. I think they're going to come around. I mean, I think that the leadership elites here in the U.S. are kind of out of step with the population. Also, the population wants to lean in and provide more help. And the administration, to a certain extent, does a show of that. Providing 100 switchblades, that's not going to really do much, but it seems like we're doing more. But we'll probably catch up with where our population wants us to go, because they have a pretty decent sense of the stakes here, which is democracy, even without necessarily understanding the interests, the long-term interests that we have with regards to helping Ukraine win this war.
Alex, this is fascinating, I think, and thank you for your time. I've got just a couple of questions, one serious question, one not so serious, I suppose. But when I opened this up, I talked about our focus and interest in this area because of the atrocities and what's going on, of course, but also the economic impact. Yeah. And we kind of are seeing the near-term economic impacts unfold, but longer term, is the Iron Curtain dropping again? How is this going to play out going forward? Obviously, over the last couple of decades, Russia has become a very important part of the economy, the world economy, and for a lot of different reasons and a lot of different product types and so forth. But do you see them isolating again? Is this a Cold War again? Is this the Iron Curtain dropping? That's the serious question. And then I'll save the last question for the last question. How about that? Go ahead, Alex.
So I think that's a perceptive question, because in fact we are locked into a Cold War. We're locked into a Cold War as long as Putin's in power. We're locked into a scenario where Russia will remain isolated. This isn't just simply governments levying sanctions. There are some of the largest commercial entities in the world are taking billions of dollars in write-off to extract themselves from the Russian market. That is not something that's going to turn around. As long as Putin's in power, Russia is toxic. And I think as long as Zelensky is in power, that'll energize investment in the spirit of the West to support Ukraine. But I think we should also, I wrote an article in the New York Times during this first summit between President Biden and Vladimir Putin. And I kind of talked about this idea of casting aside wishful thinking about Russia rather, and that we're locked into a trajectory of adversarial behavior through 2036. He had 2 more terms after he concludes his term in 2024. Those were kind of all but certain. I think this is the beginning of the end for him. It's the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin, because there have been some major mistakes, and those are not easy to recover from. I think it's very, very likely that we may only have Vladimir Putin in power for just a couple more years, and that there's even to end the suffering and the economic isolation, there's probably a new leadership that's emerges in Russia, and then there's an opportunity to kind of ease Russia back into the world as we should keep the door open for kind of a reconciliation with Russia. We can't afford to pass up an opportunity, at least to try to have Russia as a member of contributing member of the world, the largest country. So I think that's something that we need to do, but we also need to do it carefully and do it with demands, frankly. And those demands are that Russia drops its sense of exceptionalism and its entitlement to control over the territories around it, sovereign states around Russia, and that it does not seek to attack U.S. or NATO interests. So I think there's something to be said there. And this is what this is. The bigger struggle is really about authoritarianism and democracy, something I've been writing around for a long time. This is a major battle in the 21st century struggle for democracy versus authoritarianism. It looked for a while like authoritarianism was on the rise. This will be a huge setback, and this will allow the U.S. to continue to preserve a system that's allowed democracies to thrive. So I think that's important. And I know there's one more question coming. I'll just briefly mention that I'm talking to a group of builders, and there's going to be a need to rebuild. So there's an opportunity to think creatively about how to do that. I know I've already started moving in that direction, but looking forward to your contributions in that regard.
Well, I can assure you that builders and developers, if there's one thing they like to do, that is build and develop. And so, hopefully this will wind down sooner than later, I suppose, and get there. Your work with Vote Vets, fantastic stuff. We've got, as I said at the start, the link is in the chat room for those of you who'd like to contribute to Alex's work and in that area. That'd be great. We'd urge you to do that. I guess, you mentioned Zelensky's comedy act. Mm-hmm. You had your run in comedy, and I can't let it go without saying that you were on the season finale of Curb Your Enthusiasm. It was quite hilarious. Mm-hmm. And for any Curb fans out there that haven't seen it, take a look at it. It's very good. Alex, how in the world did you keep a straight face in some of those scenes? Were hilarious. And Larry David, I just laugh at him when I see him. So yeah, I'm in awe of how you did that. Any comment?
He laughs at his own jokes too. He always has that like light smirk on. But it's just kind of like it's been a surreal path since leaving government. I've worked very, very hard to kind of pave my own way, working on this doctorate to advance my ability to kind of contribute to national security, advocating for public policy, denouncing nefarious actors. But at the same time, getting the opportunity to be on Curb Your Enthusiasm or work with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I am, I guess somebody that's open to different experiences, possibilities, also fun loving and stuff like that. I initially actually declined the offer with Larry, but then he got on a Zoom call with me, and he was pretty funny. Laid out the case. I'm in LA now. This is where my brother-in-law lives. He had a new baby that we hadn't seen yet. And I had a book coming out, and we figured we could promote that too. So it all kind of worked together. I'm very glad I did it. It was lots of fun.
Well, great. Yeah, all experiences, and is certainly a little different than your day job has been the last many years.
Yes.
But thank you so much for your time. And I hope everyone on the call enjoyed this, found this interesting material as much as I did. Thank you, Alex. We wish you well. And maybe we'll continue the conversation as you get into the reconstruction and those other activities. Perhaps we can provide some assistance there and some ideas for you or something like that. But I guess I would just call this to an end. Do you have any closing comment that you'd like to make, sir?
Yep. No, just thank you for the opportunity. And I'd say the reconstruction effort is going to start to take off. I'm talking to a fund manager here today, developing a one pager on where this is likely to go to engage with U.S. government. Asset seizures and forfeitures are going to start going into a trust to fund this enterprise, a reconstruction enterprise. So I will definitely kind of link back up with you and your team at some point to maybe see if we could leverage your expertise. Thank you.
Great. And thank you for your service in the past and your advice today. Thank you all. Hope to see you soon.